"Get out, you thief!" The store manager's voice sliced through the air as he shoved the elderly man toward the exit. Henry's frail figure stumbled, and a can of soup rolled out of his grocery bag, clattering onto the floor. In that freezing moment, dozens of eyes bore into him. Henry's heart pounded with a mix of fear and shame. He lifted his trembling hands defensively, confusion etched on his weathered face. I didn't steal anything," he pleaded softly, his voice cracking. But the manager's grip on his arm only tightened, and Henry winced in pain and despair. A rush of indignation and hurt swelled in Henry's chest. How had it come to this? How had a man who once carried honor and duty in his bones been reduced to this public humiliation? Henry felt tears welling up, not just from the pain in his shoulder where the manager grabbed him, but from a deeper ache being unseen and disrespected. The crowd murmured in judgment. To them, he was just a bent old man in shabby clothes, caught in an act of dishonesty. None of them could imagine the truth. None of them knew the storm of memories and honor locked behind Henry's tired eyes. And in that cruel moment, Henry himself wondered if all the respect he'd earned in his past had vanished forever. Little did anyone know, the truth about this quiet old man was about to erupt in the most unexpected way, turning judgment into remorse and outrage into respect. If you believe no one should be judged by their appearance, you're not alone. That day had begun like any other. In a small apartment a few blocks away, Henry Walker folded a worn military jacket and placed it gently on his bed. On the jacket's chest was a faded Army intelligence pin, a relic from a lifetime ago. At 74, those days of service felt distant. A widower with grown children living far away, Henry led a quiet, modest life in Los Angeles. He moved through the bustling city almost invisible, a humble old soldier now alone with his memories. Around noon, Henry walked to the local market to buy groceries. The bell over the door jingled softly as he entered. He nodded a polite hello to the busy cashier, though she barely looked up. Gripping a small shopping cart, Henry navigated the aisles slowly, carefully checking price tags and labels. Every dollar mattered on his fixed pension. He picked out bread, some rice, a few cans of soup, staples that could get him through the week. There was a quiet dignity in his manner as he shopped, minding his own business. Unbeknownst to Henry, he had drawn someone's attention. The store manager, Alan, had recently lectured his staff about shoplifters coming in all shapes and sizes. So when a young clerk noticed Henry's threadbare coat and slow movements, suspicion stirred. The clerk watched from behind a shelf, radioing to Alan about the old guy wandering aisle 3 for a long time. Henry, oblivious to the scrutiny, continued shopping at his leisurely pace. He paused now and then, lost in thought. As he placed a box of crackers into his cart, a faint smile crossed his lips, perhaps a memory sparked by the sound of an old song playing quietly over the store speakers. Inside Henry's jacket pocket, tucked in his worn leather wallet, were 2 precious items. A black and white photograph of a much younger Henry in uniform standing beside his unit, and a gold badge from his years as a military detective. He carried them everywhere, though he never showed them around. They were tokens of a proud history he rarely spoke of. Henry didn't seek attention or special treatment. He just wanted to live his life with the same integrity he always had. After gathering the items on his list, Henry headed to the register. He placed his goods on the counter and gave the cashier a gentle, friendly smile. The young woman rang up his purchases without much interest. Henry's hand shook slightly as he pulled out his wallet, carefully counting out exact change from a handful of bills and coins. He was always a little anxious at checkout, hoping he had enough. Today, he did. The transaction complete, Henry thanked the cashier and began to place his groceries back in his cart. Just as he was about to turn toward the exit, A figure stepped into his path. It was Alan, the manager. His expression was tense, lips pressed into a thin line. Henry looked up in mild surprise. "Is something wrong?" he asked softly. Alan folded his arms. "Sir, I need to check your pockets before you leave," he said, loud enough for a few nearby customers to hear. Henry's stomach dropped in an instant. He blinked, wondering if he had misheard. "My pockets?" he repeated, bewildered. "I paid for everything. You can see the receipt." He held up the small slip of paper with unsteady fingers. The manager snatched the receipt and glanced at it, then at Henry's shopping bag. Every item was accounted for. Yet Alan's suspicious gaze fell to a bulge in Henry's coat. Henry realized it was the outline of his wallet. Alan's voice hardened, colored by distrust. "Empty your pockets, please," he demanded coldly. A couple of customers paused with their grocery bags, watching the confrontation with raised eyebrows. Henry felt heat rising in his cheeks. This was actually happening. He was being accused like a common thief. "I haven't taken anything," he protested, his voice hushed and hurt. He patted his own coat, as if to show there was nothing but his wallet inside. But Alan took a step forward, clearly not satisfied. The young clerk hovered nearby, eyes fixed on Henry as if expecting him to bolt. "I need to be sure," Alan snapped. His patience was wearing thin, and perhaps a sliver of doubt pricked at him because he wasn't finding any obvious evidence of theft. Still, he pressed on. "Open your coat now, sir." A wave of humiliation washed over Henry. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was being treated like a criminal in front of strangers. His mouth felt dry. Slowly, Henry reached to unbutton his coat, hands trembling uncontrollably, not out of guilt, but from shock and indignity. Alan, however, grew impatient. Rather than wait, the manager suddenly lunged forward. Without warning, Alan grabbed Henry's arm with a rough yank. "Let's do this outside," Alan muttered, determined not to let a possible thief slip away. Henry gasped at the sudden force. Pain shot through his aged shoulder as Alan propelled him toward the door. Groceries tumbled from Henry's cart as he stumbled to keep up with the younger man's iron grip. "Please, you're hurting me," Henry managed to say, voice barely above a whisper. The sliding doors whooshed open, and the next moment Henry found himself being shoved out onto the concrete walkway. He nearly lost his balance, catching himself against the wall. The world spun in a haze of fear and disbelief. This was a nightmare of indignity he never imagined he'd ever endure. If you've ever seen an innocent person treated unfairly, you know how painful it is. What would you do in this situation? Henry landed hard on his knees as Alan shoved him outside. A can of soup rolled into the parking lot, and a loaf of bread fell out of its bag. Henry's palms scraped the rough concrete, stinging with pain. Gasping, he tried to steady himself. A small crowd began to form just outside the store, drawn by the commotion. Heart pounding, Henry looked up at Alan, who now loomed over him with a stern, triumphant glare, as if he'd just caught a dangerous criminal. Henry's worn leather wallet had slipped from his coat in the chaos and lay open on the ground. Its contents, crumpled dollar bills, a creased black and white photo, and a gold badge, spilled out for all to see. The young clerk darted forward and snatched up the shiny badge, not understanding what it was, only that it didn't look like a store item. He handed it to Alan with a puzzled frown. Alan held the gold emblem up to the light, examining it with a sneer. The badge bore the American eagle and an inscription, but Alan wasn't really reading it. He was convinced it was fake. Maybe a trinket Henry carried to con people. Henry's heart clenched as he saw his badge in the manager's hand. That badge was no trinket. It was the symbol of his honor, earned through decades of service. Seeing it treated like a cheap prop made Henry's blood boil. "You have no right to do this," Henry said, voice shaking but audible. Struggling to his feet, he squared his shoulders as best he could, facing Alan. Something in Henry's tone gave the manager a brief pause. It was the tone of authority, of a man who had given commands and saved lives. "I served my country faithfully for years," Henry continued, breathless, "and I've stolen nothing." Alan's eyes narrowed. "Served? Don't play games with me, old man," he spat, holding up the badge. "You think carrying a fake badge from a thrift store gives you a free pass?" His words dripped with sarcasm and certainty. To him, Henry's story was just an act, and he was determined to break it. Henry felt a surge of frustration and despair. "It's not fake," he said hoarsely, reaching out a hand. "Please, give it back." He wasn't begging for mercy, just for the return of his dignity symbolized by that badge. Alan curled his lip, misreading Henry's plea as a last-ditch effort of a caught thief. "This?" he scoffed, waving the badge dismissively. "Fine, you want your little toy back? Take it and get out, and don't you ever— Attention!" A deep, commanding voice rang out, cutting through Alan's tirade like a knife. The authoritative shout was so sudden and powerful that Alan froze mid-sentence. The clerk nearly jumped. Henry's eyes snapped toward the source of the voice, as did everyone else's. Striding across the pavement was a tall, formidable man in a crisp army dress uniform. Rows of colorful ribbons adorned his chest, and on his shoulder flashed 2 silver stars. He had the bearing of someone used to being obeyed without question. In a split second, the small crowd parted to make way. Alan was caught off guard, staring at the uniformed stranger with wide eyes. "Who?" he began, but his voice faltered. The figure bypassed the onlookers and came straight toward Henry and Alan. The late afternoon sun haloed the man's stern face as he took in the scene. An elderly man on the ground, a manager clutching a badge, and groceries scattered everywhere. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He recognized that man. Despite the neatly trimmed gray hair and the decades that had passed, Henry would never forget those resolute eyes. "Major Armstrong," he whispered under his breath in astonishment. The uniformed man reached them and stopped. General Robert Armstrong couldn't believe what he was seeing. Could this injured, humiliated gentleman truly be the same Colonel Henry Walker who had once saved his life so many years ago? He saw the confusion and hurt on Henry's face and the badge in Alan's hand, and within a heartbeat he understood the situation. General Armstrong drew himself up even taller, and in a voice brimming with authority, he addressed the manager sharply. "Manager, drop that and stand aside." Alan, startled and unsure, reflexively stepped back. The general then turned squarely toward Henry. He clicked his polished heels together and in one fluid motion raised his right hand in a salute. The crowd watched in stunned silence. A decorated army general was saluting a man who, moments before, had been mocked as a thief. Henry stood dumbfounded. Automatically, his training kicked in. He tried to stand as straight as his aching back allowed and shakily returned the salute. Tears blurred Henry's eyes as he did so, overwhelmed by the respect being shown to him in the very moment he felt most disrespected. Alan's jaw hung slack. He was utterly confounded. Saluting, "Colonel," the words and images weren't computing. The badge nearly slipped from his fingers as reality crashed down on him. This was no charade. Henry was exactly who he claimed, and far more. "Colonel Henry Walker," General Armstrong said, lowering his salute and extending a steady hand to Henry. His voice was warm with camaraderie now. "It's been a long time, sir." Henry grasped the general's hand firmly. "General Armstrong, I can't believe it," he replied, voice choked with emotion. It felt like waking from a bad dream into a far better one. Alan, face pale as a sheet, immediately thrust the badge back into Henry's other hand. His fingers trembled as he released it. I'm so sorry," Alan stammered, words fumbling out in a rush of panic and regret. He suddenly realized he was in the presence of not one, but two high-ranking military heroes, and he had just manhandled one of them. For a moment, no one else spoke. A hush had fallen on the gathering. Shoppers, clerks, passers-by, everyone stood still, absorbing the extraordinary turn of events. They watched the old man they'd assumed was a nobody now being treated with the highest honor by a U.S. Army general. Shame and pity washed over those who had jumped to conclusions, and some eyes brimmed with tears at the emotional sight. Those who had been so quick to judge were now speechless, the truth of Henry's identity changing their hearts in an instant. If you believe respect should be earned by actions, not appearances, join our community. A few minutes later, back inside the store, General Armstrong stood next to Henry like a protective son beside his father. In a clear, steady voice, the general addressed everyone around. "This man is not a thief," he declared. "This is Colonel Henry Walker, a decorated veteran and one of the finest officers I have ever known." The crowd that had followed them inside listened in awe. Alan, the manager, stepped forward, his face flushed with remorse. He took a shaky breath, struggling to find the right words. "Colonel Walker, I am so sorry," Alan said, his voice low and sincere. "I was horribly wrong to judge you by your appearance. I don't know what else to say, except that I'm sorry." His eyes were wet, and he could barely meet Henry's gaze. Henry, still overwhelmed, held his badge close to his chest. He looked at Alan's anguished face and felt the younger man's shame. With a compassionate nod, Henry extended his hand. "I forgive you," he said softly. His voice carried no malice, only exhaustion and kindness. "You were doing what you thought was right, son, even if it was wrong." Henry could have been angry, but he had fought too many battles in life to hold on to bitterness now. His gentle grace in that moment made those watching realize they were witnessing not just a veteran, but a man of immense character. Alan swallowed hard and shook Henry's hand gratefully, humbled by the older man's magnanimity. General Armstrong offered a proud smile at his old comrade. Then he turned to the onlookers. In brief, respectful words, he recounted how Colonel Walker had saved an entire unit of soldiers during a covert mission years ago. "I'm standing here today because of this man's courage," the general concluded, placing a hand on Henry's shoulder. As Henry listened to General Armstrong's words, he felt almost shy. He had never sought recognition for what he'd done, yet seeing the gratitude and astonishment on the faces around him filled Henry with quiet pride and relief. When the general finished, a collective gasp came from the small crowd. A few people broke into appreciative applause. Others wiped away tears, moved by the revelation that the quiet elder they'd seen in the neighborhood was an unsung hero. A woman in a cashier's uniform stepped forward hesitantly. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said to Henry, her voice trembling with emotion. Several others echoed her sentiment in soft murmurs. Henry's cheeks turned pink, and he bowed his head humbly. "Thank you," he replied gently, his heart full as he realized he was finally seen for who he truly was. Alan cleared his throat, determined to make amends in any way he could. He picked up Henry's grocery bag, which he had repacked. "Please, let us cover the cost of these," Alan insisted. "And you are welcome here any time, Colonel. Any time. It would be an honor to have you shop with us again." Henry managed a faint smile and accepted the bag. "That's very kind of you, Alan," he said. The use of the manager's first name was deliberate, a gesture of forgiveness and an acceptance of the apology. General Armstrong gently placed his hand against Henry's back, a gesture of both support and camaraderie. "How about I drive you home, Henry?" the general suggested. "We have a lot of catching up to do." There was a spark of happiness in the old detective's eyes as he nodded. "I'd like that very much." As they began to leave the store together, the crowd parted respectfully. A few people clapped more openly now, and one called out, "God bless you, Colonel." Henry felt fresh tears forming, not of sadness this time, but of gratitude. He gave a little wave to the well-wishers as he passed. The manager, Alan, stood by the door, watching the two men step out into the waning daylight. Henry turned to look at Alan one last time and offered a forgiving nod. Alan nodded back, a silent promise in his eyes that he had learned a profound lesson today. Outside, the sky was painted with the orange and pink of sunset. General Armstrong helped Henry into the passenger seat of his car, handling him with the utmost care. Before driving off, the general paused. "Henry, do you remember that motto from our unit?" he asked, a gentle smile on his face. Henry chuckled softly and recited, "We leave no one behind." "That's right," the general said, his eyes shining. "I'm glad I was here today. I'm glad I didn't leave you behind." In the weeks that followed, word of the incident spread throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once barely noticed Henry now greeted him warmly on the street. Some thanked him for his service. Others simply offered a friendly wave and a smile. Henry, who had long felt invisible, found himself surrounded by kindness and respect. It lifted his spirits in ways he hadn't thought possible. At the grocery store, Alan made sure nothing like that day would ever happen again. He trained his staff to treat every customer with respect, no matter what they looked like. And every time Henry walked through those doors, which he did often, always personally greeted by Alan, the entire staff made him feel welcome and appreciated. True to his word, General Armstrong became a frequent visitor at Henry's little apartment. The two old comrades would spend afternoons sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes quiet moments of reflection over cups of tea. The general's presence brought a piece of Henry's past back into his life, reminding him that he would never truly be alone or forgotten. Henry's story is a powerful reminder to everyone. Appearances can be deceiving, and every person deserves respect. There are hidden heroes among us living humble lives. We should treat each other with kindness and dignity, because we never know who might turn out to be a true hero in plain sight. In the end, a day that began in injustice ended in honor and hope, proving that a little understanding can reveal the extraordinary within the ordinary. For Henry, it was the day he regained something truly precious, his honor, and the comforting knowledge that his contributions had not been forgotten.